Thank you, Frans. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to be here after 30 years. 30 years ago, we had a workshop in Paris. I think Adam was there, Frans was there, Peter Rogers was there as well, and a number of other brilliant scientists. And I think it was the start of the badness of sweetness. And we're still about there, I think. I think let me first start with the basic premise of sweetness. I think everybody will agree that we love sweetness. We have an inborn liking for sweetness from birth onwards. I think the optimal sweetness level in foods declines until adulthood, and then I think stays stable across the lifespan. Recently, we did a study of food supplies in Asia and in the Netherlands, and we looked at sweetness levels across the whole food supply in Malaysia and across the Netherlands. And what was a bit of a surprise to me, that when you profile about 500 foods representative of the food supply in the Netherlands or in Malaysia, and then when you look at the mean sweetness level, they are virtually identical. And also when you look at the sweetness level of an Australian diet, when you profile 500 Australian foods, you get a value around 20, 25. And when you look at the first quartile in the Netherlands, it has a sweetness value of 6 out of a scale of 100. And the third quartile of foods has a sweetness value of about 35. So I think I should point a question mark behind this. But when you look at different food supplies across the world, I think the general sweetness levels, they are more or less similar. Of course, there's some changes, specific changes of some foods, but in general, I think it's quite similar. I was quite surprised to see these levels. I'm going to talk about sweetness, appetite, and obesity. First, start with a few of the narratives. Of course, people love narratives, and they're very tempting, and of course, you feel it in your gut that it's true. And we have a lot of narratives, of course, about sweetness. Then I'll discuss some data on these narratives, and then the issues remaining. Of course, we know that sweetness signals energy in foods, and that has been around the literature already for a long time. And if you look at textbooks on taste and the function of taste, then you will always see that sweetness signals energy. Overweight people, they consume more energy, so it's logical that they have a sweet tooth, because then they like sweetness more, and of course that's very logical. So you would also expect that overweight people consume more energy from sweet-tasting foods, otherwise they wouldn't be overweight, wouldn't it? And a third and a fourth narrative, when I speak to colleagues, also to scientific colleagues who think sweetness is bad, they say, yeah, but because sweetness potentiates energy intake, and that's the reason why it's bad. If you have no sweetness, then people do not eat so much. So if you add sweetness, of course, then people will eat more, and then they get fat. There's also among my scientific colleagues who argue this is the case. I'll show you some data on this, some of our own data, some recent data, some older data. First, sweetness as a signal for the energy content of food. And when you look at the real data, and recently in a number of countries across the world, people have looked at the taste data on whole food supplies. In Australia, about 400 foods representative of the Australian diet. In the Netherlands, we looked at about 500 foods. In Malaysia, and also in France and in the US. And when you look at the correlations between the sweetness profile, so the sweetness intensity and the energy content of foods, what you actually see is that there's virtually a zero correlation between the sweetness level, sweetness intensity of a particular food across the food supply and its energy content. Sweet does relate to the carbohydrate content. Umami taste intensity does relate to the protein content. salt intensity does relate to the sodium content, and fat sensation intensity relates to the fat content of foods. But sweet does not relate to energy intake, energy content in the food supply. Let's go on to the sweet tooth obesity hypothesis. This has also been around for a long, long time, and this is an early study of my actual promoter. I did a PhD thesis on the sweetness of mixtures of sweeteners, but already in 1982, Jan Vrijters, he published a paper in Journal of General Psychology where he compared 10 normal weight women with 10 overweight women, and I don't think you will get that published now. but he actually compared perceived sweetness intensity and liking for sweet foods, and in the end he concluded the data showed that the two groups did not differ in any of these functions or measures, individual variability and so on. So already in 1982 this was already a discussion, and I think after this study dozens of studies also investigated this area. And I think one of the last studies, I forget all the studies in between, this is a nice study of Noël Bobovsky and Julie Manella from Monell. And she compares the optimal sweetness levels, both originating from sucrose and sucralose, in normal weight people and obese people, and also in children, and obese children and normal weight children. And what you can see is that the optimal sweetness levels in obese and non-obese people are quite similar. What you also see in relation to what I said earlier is that optimal sweetness levels are lower or are higher in children than they are in adults. So I think there's no difference in optimal sweetness levels between obese and normal weight people. Let's then look at the consumption of sweet tasting foods. This is recent data from our lab. We did this quite a number of years of work. What we did, we profiled about 500 Dutch foods with a modified spectrum method. So, and we selected those 450 foods that represented the majority of the energy intake of Dutch people. Then we profiled them and we measured sweetness, saltiness, bitterness, umami taste intensity, fat sensation intensity on a spectrum scale, so with solutions as standardized concentrations for sweetness intensity, and so that you have a kind of objective measure of the intensity. When we profiled these foods, then we did a statistical analysis on a cluster analysis, and we divided the whole food supply into 6 food groups according to taste. And what we then, the next step was that we looked at the contribution of these taste clusters to the overall energy intake in the Dutch diet. So you can then look at, on an individual basis, to the contribution of sweet tasting foods to the total energy content of the diet. So it's not a sensory measure, but it's kind of behavioral measure reflected in the taste pattern. Here you see the clusters. We have 6 clusters across 500 foods. So the overall sweetness is about, on average, about 22. We have a cluster of fatty foods, about 37 foods. And then you can think of foods like mayonnaise. We have a neutral cluster, which is much bigger. Then you can think of rice and bread and pasta and these types of things. Sweet sour foods, 66 types of fruits, more or less. And then you can think like an apple. Salt, umami, fat. In Holland, that's we like a lot of cheese, of course, and of course meats will also fall into this group. Then you have a group of sweet fatty foods like chocolate and chocolate milk and the things that people like. And then a group of bitter foods, only a minority, which is mainly about coffee and these types, and some alcoholic beverages. And these contribute about 83% of total energy intake in the Dutch population. Then we looked at the intake of various groups. We started with men and women, and we looked at this in 2 big data sets, one the Dutch National Food Consumption Survey and another big cohort, about 1,000 people, a dietary assessment methodology study. And what you can see here is that the intake from sweet fatty foods is, and sweet sour foods is higher in women than it is in men. And you can see that the total intake of sweet foods is about 30% of the total energy intake, divided among sweet fatty foods and among sweet sour foods. So I think this is also the first data set that shows actually that women eat more sweet foods than men. Then when you look at weight status, in both for men, it's clear that with an increase BMI, you see actually a slight decrease in the intake of sweet-tasting foods. And that applies both for sweet and fatty foods and for sweet sour foods, which you can think of fruits. So actually there's not an increase in sweet food intake, but there's actually a slight decrease in food intake. And what we also see is that with increasing BMI, you see an increase in in savory fatty foods. So more obese people, they consume more of savory fatty foods than non-obese people. The same trend applies for women. Also in women, you see that obese women and overweight women, they consume slightly less of sweet fatty foods and also of sweet sour foods. The next thing I would like to discuss is the role of sweetness in satiation. And while preparing for this talk, I encountered this study, which I must confess I almost forgot, but I think it's a very nice study where we did about 10 years ago. We looked at satiation, so that is meal termination, and the role of sweetness on savoriness in this issue. And what we did, of course, when you compare sweet and savory foods, what you often will have is that you will have had totally different foods. You compare chocolate with savory with meat or something, but of course that's not a good comparison. So what we did here, we had sweet and savory foods with an identical composition, just flavored differently. So we had rice meals, and you could imagine a rice meal which tastes very savory, like an Indonesian nasi goreng or a Chinese flavored rice, which has a distinct savory taste. But you can also have a rice pudding-like thing with a vanilla, cinnamon kind of flavor. And so that's what we did. We just asked people to come at the lab and consume as much or as little of the rice as they wanted, either a savory version or a sweet version. We did that in 3 conditions, just measuring ad libitum intake. And in 2 other conditions, we also measured appetite ratings in between. And we also, in a 3rd condition, we measured the Leeds Food Preference Questionnaire, which is a preference questionnaire developed by Graham Finlayson in Leeds. And we had about 64 subjects. When you look at the overall intake, the result is very, very clear. There's no difference in neither of the 3 test conditions. So either a sweet taste or a savory taste, independent of energy density, palatability, macronutrient content, and all factors. Satiation, it's not affected by savoriness or differentially affected by sweetness or savoriness. Finally, we did a study on what happens. The argument is that sweetness potentiates intake. Slightly a few years later, we did a study on satiety. And then we looked at the effect of a 24-hour diet consisting only of sweet-tasting foods or consisting only of savory-tasting foods or a mixture of these foods. And then we looked at the appetitive profile and also at the intake at the next day at lunch. So the people started at lunch at one day, then they got a sweet lunch or a savory lunch or a mixed lunch. Then for the remainder of the day, they also got either sweet foods or savory foods until the lunch next day. So in one case, people only consumed sweet foods throughout 24 hours, and in the other condition, they only consumed savory foods throughout 24 hours. And also the diets were equal in energy density, in texture, in macronutrient composition, and all that type of stuff. And the outcome variables here were the appetite for something sweet that people rated every hour during the day, and the appetite for something savory that people rated at every hour the day. And we also measured ad libitum intake of sweet and savory foods at the lunch 24 hours after consuming this diet. Here you see appetite for something sweet as a function of the taste of the diet, and what you see is that appetite for something sweet declines when you have a sweet diet. And I think everybody in this room probably can imagine that if you consume sweet foods for 24 hours, you just get very bored with it. You just long for a savory taste. And so here what you see is a very clear sensory specific effect that sweet foods suppress appetite for something sweet, and it's also the other way around. That savory foods, they suppress appetite for something savory. So what you see is of course you see a very strong differential sensory effect, but you see no absolute effect on the appetite ratings. And finally, when you look at lunch intake after 24 hours of either consuming sweet or savory foods, what you see is that the energy content of the lunch is exactly equal, so there's no difference after these 24 hours. But what you do see is after the sweet diet that the intake of sweet foods, denoted here, this is also looking at protein, but I won't discuss that right now, high protein sweet foods and low protein sweet foods. But after the sweet diet, the intake of sweet foods is much less than after the savory diet, and I think that's also what you can expect. So there's not such a, I would say, sweetness potentiation of energy intake, because when you consume sweet foods, you also get satiated with sweet foods, and I would more or less guarantee you, if I give you a chocolate diet, that you also will lose weight in the end, because you just get bored with it and you get satiated with the taste of it. So summarizing the data, I think the liking for sweetness is inborn, and I think it's universal across the world. Maybe there are different countries that have different levels of sweetness, but so far as we have concerned, we looked at Australia, France, the Netherlands, and Malaysia, and there you see very similar levels of sweetness. Sweetness does not signal the energy content in current day food supplies. There's simply no correlation. The correlation is much higher between saltiness and energy content, and also much higher between fattiness intensity and energy content. There's no difference in sweetness perception or liking as a function of weight status. I think that has been investigated dozens and dozens of times, but it doesn't go away. I guess next year there may be more studies on this subject with the same introduction. And I think overweight, obese people in the Dutch situation, at least, they consume slightly less sweet foods, and they consume more savory, fatty tasting foods. And I think that this is also in line with other data from France, which looked at epidemiological data at the liking for various types of foods. A big cohort study of Delglaire, I think from Paris or Dijon, and they showed similar data that obese people have a high liking for more fatty, savory tasting foods. And I think the effect of sweetness and savoriness on intake, I think they're more or less equal, but they of course have very strong specific effects on appetite and satiety. Remaining issues, I think there's one big question related to sweetness which is still open in the air. A colleague of mine, Catherine Appleton, a psychologist here from the UK, recently published a systematic review in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition on the effects of sweetness exposure on the generalized preference for sweetness in various foods. And to my surprise, some of the studies that we included here, they were included in that review, but actually we don't know whether if you enhance the sweetness exposure or lower the sweetness exposure, whether that will change the preference for sweetness. So I think that's it's silly, but it's still a very open question, an important question open in the literature. Can we get used to low sweetness levels or high sweetness levels? I think that's an important question. And of course, for salt, that question has partly been answered already by the early studies of Gary Beecham and Bertino in the 1980s, where they showed that you can adjust to various levels of salt, but for sugar or for sweetness, that there are no studies out there that show the similar thing. So I think there's an urgent question that needs to be answered. Otherwise, policymakers will deal with what you now see in France, where also low energy sweetened beverages are taxed because they are sweet, and sweetness is bad, and no matter what the data say. So I think we have a responsibility here to produce some data. I think also a very important issue is, I think we know that sugar-sweetened beverages as a whole, they lead to an overconsumption of energy intake, and I think also overweight. But I think there's an urgent need also to look at sweetness in solid form. So, of course, people have the impression that biscuits and chocolate and all that type of things make you fat. But I think there are very few long-term randomized trials to look at these effects. I think when you look at the sugar data, they almost always refer to sweetness in the form of liquid, in the form of sugar-sweetened beverages. And I think, of course, RCT with solid sweetness is much more difficult to do, but I think there's an urgent need to follow that up. The third question is, I think there are very distinct differences between the also sensory profile of different people. And we see people who consume a very sweet diet, we see people who consume a very savory diet. But to be honest, I have no clue what's going on there, and I have no clue about the biology or what's causing these differences in preferences. So I think that's also a very exciting question to look ahead, and I won't do that, but I think there's a younger generation who will do that, and yeah. So I think there are plenty of questions still ahead of us. Do I still have time, or am I over? No? Yeah? I would like to end then with a movie. I think some of you will already have seen it. It's about grapes and grape juice, which I think emphasized the difference between solids and liquids, and also its effect on intake. But I think most of you have not seen it. I think Peter and other people have seen it already before. But it's just a funny way of ending. I think there's such a big difference between sweetness in solid or in liquid form.
We want a juice box, a juicy juice box, not your everyday ordinary juice box. We want a treat so sweet that every kid we meet lines up for 2 blocks. We want a juice box. They want a juice box. They want to have a sip. They say a new rock. We want a treat so sweet that every kid we meet lines up for 2 blocks. We want a juice box. We want a juice box, a juicy juice box, not your everyday ordinary juice box. We want a treat so sweet that every kid we meet lines up for 2 blocks. We want a juice box. They want a juice juice, a juicy juice juice. They want to get some of that fruity tooty choo choo. I got my penny straw. No, I don't need a cup. I put my straw into that box and then I drink it up. I got that booty punch. You wish I had a bunch so I could give all of you kids up it up what you want. You better ask your mom, so don't be hating me. And maybe next time you can sip your juice next to me. We want a juice box, a juicy juice box, not your everyday ordinary juice box. We want a treat so sweet that every kid we meet lines up for 2 blocks. We want a juice box, we want a juice box, a juicy juice box, not your everyday ordinary juice box. We want a treat so sweet that every kid we meet lines up for 2 blocks. We want a juice box. Orange, cherry, grape. We think they all taste great. Yeah, we really like fruit punch and all the flavors of the month. There's apple and there's peach and there's kiwi, strawberry. So many it's hard to choose. It's a treat we can't refuse. We want a juice box, a juicy juice box, not your everyday ordinary juice box. We want a treat so sweet that every kid we meet lines up for 2 blocks. We want a juice box, we want a juice box, a juicy juice box, not your everyday ordinary juice box. We want a treat so sweet that every kid we meet lines up for 2 blocks. We want a juice box.
Well, sweetness is depends on the texture, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.